Hello, good morning, everybody. Bright and early Tuesday morning here in Jamaica, nice and sunny. A good change from the rain that we've been having for the last couple of weeks. My name is Teresa Rodriguez Moody, and today is day two of Caribbean Environment Week, where we are taking bold steps towards a sustainable future. I am joined by three very exciting guests. We have James Elsmore, who is the founder and CEO of Island Innovation. We have Dr. Kevin Riney, who is assistant professor from the Department of Geography, Rutgers University, and a former University of the West Indies student and lecturer. We also have Jayaka Campbell, who is assistant lecturer at the Department of Physics, University of the West Indies. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Teresa.
Good morning, James.
How are you? You guys could sound a little bit more excited.
We are excited.
Well, today is day two of our Climate Environment Week, where we are looking at climate change, our new reality. Yesterday, we were joined by Mr. Vincent Sweeney, who is head of the Caribbean Sub-Regional Office of UNEP, and Eleanor Jones, CEO and chairman of Environmental Solutions Limited. I am also a member of, or a staff member of Environmental Solutions Limited. I'm the manager of environmental management services there. And we had a brief introduction to climate change. And something Mr. Sweeney said, and I think a lot of people know, is that Caribbean countries and economies are very highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And at the same time, we're minor contributors to greenhouse gases, but we're going to be the most severely impacted. In May of 2020, we heard from NOAA that we were going to have an above normal 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. And while Jamaica, specifically here because I'm here, but while Jamaica didn't have any hurricanes, you can see from some of the pictures on the screen that, well, not all of this is current, but we have this year been, just the rainfall alone, been severely affected by heavy rainfall, landslides. In Tropical Storm Zeta, which was in October, we had landslides, we had a lot of damage to our roads. And it is only time in history that we've ever used the name Zeta. And it had in Jamaica about $2 billion worth of damage. Then we had Zeta, which was like maybe a week or two later. This was the storm for season. And this is the first time. And then I think last night we had Tropical Storm Theta. This is the 29th storm. So they have not disappointed. This is the most active hurricane we've ever seen in the Atlantic. And it just one storm after the next. I mean, look at what happened in 2017, where we had Irma, and then right after we had Hurricane Maria 2 weeks later. And we're seeing where climate change is causing a major change in the patterns that we maybe grew up seeing. For some of us, like myself, younger, we're seeing a major change in just our lifetime. And compared to some of the older generation who are seeing some major shifts. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of talking about climate change being our new reality, I'm going to ask each of you to just give me a brief introduction about yourselves and why, if you think that climate change is in fact our new reality. Maybe let's start with James. James, we're not hearing you.
Sorry, it seems like there's multiple mute buttons in different places and I hadn't pressed the right one.
Okay, great.
You can hear me now, yeah. My name is James Elsmore. I run an organization called Island Innovation, and we exist to share information and connect different islands around the world. So clearly what's happening in the Caribbean has parallels with what's happening in the South Pacific and other SIDS regions, small island developing states. But even with islands in my own country, I'm from the UK, we have many smaller island communities in Scotland, and there are other islands around Europe. And so there are these commonalities across islands, and climate change is an important one, but as are other factors too. And I must say that in terms of the climate change discussion, we can't ignore the fact that the US elections have just happened, which is really important in this conversation, not to get political straight away, but the US hopefully the US will now be rejoining the Paris Agreement, which was an agreement between every single country in the world, unprecedented, that the US had pulled out of. And small island states like the Caribbean and other regions have taken a real role in that. So yes, I mean, there's an important conversation to be had, and what's happening in Jamaica and around the Caribbean is also happening in other parts of the world, and it's important to look at that global picture.
Thanks, James. Kevin?
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this very interesting webinar. So I am currently an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Rutgers. I'm a geoscientist by training, and I taught at the University of the West Indies for several years. That's also where I got my degree from. I worked closely with Jay and Michael Taylor and a couple others from the Climate Studies group, and I've also worked so closely with Teresa and so many others in Jamaica on environmental issues. So a lot of my research is centered around natural hazards and disasters, shocks, and thinking about how people respond to shocks, how different shocks impact different people differently. And so naturally, climate change is a big part of the work that I do. And it is part of our new reality for many of the things that you mentioned earlier and what James also mentioned. I mean, we see the record-breaking hurricane seasons we've been having. Also here, I'm currently in the United States. I'm on the West Coast now, actually. I'm going to Big Sur. Just want to get away and do something crazy. And, this is a place as I was driving down along the West Coast, just looking at the scars from the recent fires, the wildfires in California. And seeing people still trying to pick pieces and put pieces together to recover from that. It's something that, for me, it's not just about even small island states anymore. You're seeing the impact across the world, as we've seen with Brazil recently, and the Amazon fires. So yeah, for me, I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're going to be having as part of this webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. And Jay?
I was hoping to go first. There's not much left for me to say, but in my time, I am, as much of I'm an assistant lecturer at university, much of my work is centered on generating regional climate scenarios for the region. And by generating regional climate scenarios for the Caribbean, I'm talking about scenarios that would be at scale, matching the small size of much of the islands we have. And an interesting thought I had while I was invited to this is, instead of looking at the Caribbean as the most vulnerable, we can treat ourselves as the canary in a mine. We are giving an alert. We are suggesting that something is about to change, so something major is about to happen. And if we look at ourselves as the canaries that are actually now giving an alert, it puts us in a position that we must be taken seriously. And if the impact is going to be that severe to us, then guess what? It's time for everybody to jump on board, or else we're all without a space to actually save future worlds. All right, that's it for me.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you, gentlemen, for that brief introduction. We're gonna have a poll question right now, and before we jump into it. And the question is, do you believe that climate change is a major threat that has already begun to impact us? I'm gonna ask everybody who's on, just to do a response. Yes, no, not sure. You can vote as well. The panelists can also give a response.
No, we can't.
Panelists can't vote.
On my screen. Okay, I'm gonna leave it for another 10 seconds. And then We'll pull it down. Okay. The responses, yes, 100% of the responses said that they believe that climate change is a major threat that has already begun to impact us. All right, thank you, my lovely co-hosts who are working behind the scenes. All right, so, you know, from a scientist background, climate change interests me. But for those of us that are not scientists, and at the same time are being impacted, can you break it down for us, Jay, a little bit in simple language, because I know you can get really technical. In simple language, what is climate change, and are these predictions reliable?
All right, first and foremost, let me take the historical point of view of it, and I'll give you the future perspective of it.
Sure.
Simple definition is a deviation from a standard average. That average is typically taken over a 20 to 30 year period. So we're not looking at what happened last year versus what happened this year. We're taking an average state of your climate, and then we're looking if there are deviations from that average state. Now, much of the persons who've said, yes, we would have experienced some kind of change, may not realize that when you take the climate data from the Met stations, and we've taken data from 1960 onwards to 2010, and we're actually examining what happens over, you take a 30-year period and you examine what happens post that 30-year period. That data is suggesting that we've been experiencing more warmer days. We're experiencing fewer cold nights, and it's suggesting that our nighttime temperatures are getting towards being our daytime temperatures. When you actually know we're supposed to go to work, and you turn on your AC when you get home, or your fan when you get home, and you turn it off at 1 o'clock because it gets too cold, you now have to leave that device running right throughout the night because your temperatures are now approaching your daytime temperatures. So that's the easiest way for me to actually say a little bit about climate change. That's the past. For the future, it's somewhat similar. We take climate models, which are computer models, and actually make projections into the future of what our climate will be. We validate that against what is currently happening. And so we can actually say with some degree of confidence what our projections are indeed, in fact. And I will end my response there.
Are these projections reliable? I mean, I'm not in any doubt, but if there are any doubters out there, are we very sure about what we're seeing, what the science is telling us?
All right, well, the science told us that we would be experiencing 1.5 degree kind of temperature. And another way to look at it, the science told us that between the mid-2020s and mid-2030s, somewhere there, we would have experienced the warmest day we face then. The coldest year we'll face after that point will still be warmer than the warmest year we faced before. If you look at it and you say, well, that's still not here yet, examine what has happened between 2000 and 2019. The warmest years on record, the top 5 of all occurred since 2010. And this is examining 150 years, 140 years of temperature records, which means given that one thing, and I'm not talking about data from one institution, I'm talking about data out of the UK Hadley Med Center, we're talking about data out of NASA, we're talking about data from NOAA. So 3 independent bodies. When you examine their data, they're suggesting that the warmest years on record of all, the 10 warmest ones have all occurred since 2000. And if persons are going to say, well, it's just a cycle. When you examine them in 10-year chunks, it gets to a point where the warmest ones of 2000s and the 2010s have been the warmest ones. So we've actually indeed seen some change. And if you correlate that with what the models are saying about our temperatures, it augurs some degree of confidence.
Okay, so the kind of rainfall, the kind of weather we've been having, and it's not just rainfall, right? Climate change is not just about rainfall, it's about, tell us a little bit more about that in sense. And it doesn't have to be only Jay, guys. I was just,
You singled me out at first.
I did.
I like comparing climate to a pot of rice and peas. It's something, or peas and rice, depending on where in the Caribbean you're from. Imagine yourself, all these ingredients can make it a wonderful dish, but you change one of those ingredients, you change the quantity of one of those ingredients, and it may be something your palate can never withstand. Too much salt, too much peas, and not enough rice. It becomes something that is not as enjoyable anymore. It deviates from that nice average. So climate in and of itself, the temperature, the rainfall, all of these things combine to relative humidity, your wind, all of these things combine to make your area what it is, that nice livable space with a warm climate, not don't go from very, very hot to very, very wet, or very, very dry to very, very wet in no time at all. So all those ingredients, it changed one of those ingredients and you're looking for a change in your overall climate regime. I'm going to open the floor now to Dr. Riney to chime in, or James to chime in, so that I'm not the only one talking.
Thanks, Jay. I could go ahead just to kind of add my bit. So for the past maybe 15 or so years, I've been working with small farmers across Jamaica, also St. Lucia, and several other Caribbean islands. And one of the things that seems to be quite evident by just speaking to farmers, who, by the way, are some of the best people to speak to, because they work, with weather, because that's how they plan their cropping cycles and so on. And one of the things that they will say, and this is perception data, of course, but it is almost a given. If you speak to a farmer these days, they'll tell you things are unpredictable, right? So one of the things with climate change as well is that things are going to become more and more unpredictable. It's not just the kind of big changes that you're going to be seeing, but also, the timing of the rainy seasons are going to change across the region. You're already seeing significant changes in terms of extreme events, particularly droughts. So yes, in addition to what Jay is pointing out about temperature, and also you could say, we've seen a significant increase in hurricane activities in the Atlantic. You're also seeing that with droughts as well. And these are huge. They're getting more severe.
Right.
Hence, and I have a colleague that works in Greenland, and every time she comes back and she talks about what she's seeing there, it's frightening. It's rivers of just ice melts heading into the ocean. And that's also kind of a huge thing for us to think about in the Caribbean. I mean, the science has already shown us that the mean sea level in the Caribbean has increased in the past 50 or so years. And in fact, I think and James could probably correct me, but I think the Caribbean has one of the highest rates of sea level increase when you compare across the global mean level. So that's going to be something significant, right, that we have to think about. When it comes on to climate change, for the Caribbean, yeah, you can say we've been feeling it in terms of the past few decades, just looking at those trends. And in terms of climate science, a lot of the pundits, a lot of the skeptics, it's not that they don't agree that the climate is changing. If you really check the story, what they're trying to say is they don't think it's linked to human activities, and they think it's part of a normal cycle. But almost everyone agrees that there has been significant changes over the past 150 years or so. I mean, it really becomes like kind of a blame shifter. And the sad thing is, and I think James actually kind of hinted at this, that we are also experiencing several extremes. One, in terms of climate, but also politically, the world is being even more polarized. We're living in a world of post-truths. And so, you're having all sorts of information on social media. And so people are struggling to kind of figure out what to take, what to digest, how to make sense of it all. So, I mean, it's really interesting. So these sort of meetings, these sort of webinars, I think, is extremely useful, where the general public can engage with people who are actually doing work on the topic.
Yeah, as you said about extremes, and in the last 150 years, as I was saying in the beginning, in my lifetime, I grew up learning that April showers, May rains, and I just the last maybe 10 years, I've not seen those April showers and the May rains as I used to. I remember when I was doing my A levels, and I could barely make it to the exam because I think it was Lily. We had Hurricane Lily, and that was earlier than normal. But it from then I haven't seen much happening. And you're right, Kevin, the farmers, they talk about it, the fishermen, they talk about it, that patterns that they grew up learning, that generate from generation to generation, that were being passed along, in terms of how we farm, how we grow, how we fish, where we fish. Those things are changing, you know. James, over to you. I wanted to find out, from a business perspective as well, you know, why is it I should care about climate change? I mean, we're scientists, a lot of us are scientists listening in or participating in the field, and it's obvious. But I'm a small business, I'm a homeowner. Why should I really care about climate change? Or how does it affect me? Why, you know, should I
Definitely.
even be listening to
Well,
this
thank you for those.
discussion?
Thank you for those two excellent answers. I think that was a really good overview of the current situation. And I wanted to highlight, before I go into that question, just the danger of averages. 1.5 degrees doesn't sound that bad. You know, who minds? Oh, 1.5 degrees,
Yeah.
that's a nice day. But the average or the average sea level rise globally, for example, that doesn't show the extremes. And 1.5 degrees, actually, for some countries, they might quite like that. There's an argument that Canada could benefit more than any other country from climate change by a small temperature increase. But the temperature is increasing in other parts. And I've heard this word climate disruption or climate catastrophe is maybe a bit too emotive, but is maybe better than climate change because it's not uniform globally. A good example of this is the impact on Europe. The UK is at the same latitude as parts of Canada and America that are much, much colder, but is kept warm by the Gulf Stream. So actually the UK could end up being colder by climate change because there'll be a disruption to ocean patterns that keep that part of the world warm. So, you know, it's very complicated and we don't fully understand what the implications are. There was a campaign led by Caribbean youth called 1.5 to Stay Alive. Which has a nice, if not morbid, ring to it. But that idea of 1.5 being kind of the absolute maximum, and I think we have to accept that climate change is happening. We can reduce the extent that it happens to, but we have to adapt. There's an adaptation element. We want to stop more climate change than is inevitable happening, but the reality is that there is going to be some level, and so there is an adaptation level. And so 1.5 was viewed as the absolute maximum that should be targeted. It's unlikely at this point that that's going to be hit, so it kind of moved up to 2 degrees, and even that we're unsure if that will be hit on a global level, and that's calculated by the amount of emissions being made globally. But as I said, that is an average. In some parts of the world, it could be much, much higher. On some days, you might get these huge temperature spikes that are really, really damaging. And obviously, this week we've seen that in terms of the weather across the Caribbean. Someone just sent me before this call pictures from Antigua, and Antigua is a pretty dry place normally, and the level of flooding there is quite unprecedented. To get back to your question about why should the average person care? I mean, if you're a homeowner, if you're a business owner, this is real. You know, floods, heat waves. Think about the level of disruption we've had this year from the pandemic and how much that could change. I mean, the tourism industry is a key economic component of the region. Obviously, how much has that been impacted by the pandemic? How much could that be impacted by future disruption to climate also? So this does impact your pocket, your lifestyle at the end of the day. It's not this abstract thing in the future, which it often feels like.
Okay, Jay had his hands raised, but before switch over to you, Jay, I just wanted to say that we're also streaming live on Live Echo YouTube for those of us that are maybe have some other persons that not on Zoom, but that want to join on YouTube. Jay, over to you. You had something you wanted to add. You're on mute.
I just want to bring to the table that there is, even though people keep saying we will miss 1.5, there is massive, massive room to actually try to keep it. Because what we've done within studies, we've examined what happens to the region at 1.5, what happens to the region at 2 degrees, and what happens to the region at 2.5. What we discovered is that you can talk about adaptation and mitigation, but that is planning for what is going to happen. Each of those thresholds represent a different thing, a different reality for the Caribbean. Above 2 and going to 2.5, there's an inversion of the changes that we would see at 1.5 and 2. So that would then mean a completely different kind of strategy for planning and adaptation if those thresholds were
what would that mean? So when you get to 2, when you say an inversion, for those of us that don't understand what that means, what does that mean for the rainfall that we've been seeing, the dry periods? Is it that we'll have a switch?
It may be a switch from those periods, but it simply means that at 1.5, between 1.5 and 2, the changes between 1.5 and 2 is just a more pronounced version of 1.5. So if it's drying in 2, it simply means, drying in 1.5, it simply means more pronounced drying in 2.
It's drier.
It may actually switch to being wet, but here's the challenge. Particular islands exist in what we call transition zones. It's a zone where you are borderline wet, borderline dry. It's unclear as to what your change is going to be, right? And that's at 1.5. It then means that it becomes very, very difficult to plan for 1.5 in a 2.5 or above world.
There's actually, Sorry, there was a slight delay there. I was just going to say on that point, there's an excellent nonfiction book that's been written by Jamaican author Diana Macaulay. If people haven't seen it, Daylight Come. It is nonfiction. It's a story, but it's looking at this dystopia. What will the Caribbean look like at the end of the century? And obviously, we don't know the truth. And it's not just it's the environmental disruption, but what impact does that have on society? If the sources of income stop coming, if the region is cut off from other suppliers, how does that completely change the society we live in? So I'll just pop a link to that in the chat, but as it's by a Jamaican author, would really recommend it for anyone kind of interested in this topic.
Okay, thank you. And this is, for those of us who are tuning in for the entire week, this actually goes really well with, I think it's day 3 or day 4, planning for an uncertain future. That is right into what you're saying, Jay. How do you plan when you're not quite sure what to expect? Climate change, we're saying, is our new reality, but even with that, it's unpredictable. It's not a clear path. You're not going to get something, oh, it's definitely drier. It's difficult, but we have to be aware of this. And, Kevin, as James was saying, we all need to care about climate change, from the homeowner to the business person. But what are some of the things that we can do? Jay mentioned adaptation. We heard about mitigation. For those of us that don't really know what that means, like, can you break that down for us a little bit? And then we're going to kind of switch into some question and answer. I see some questions coming in. Maybe we can take some questions and break it.
All right, thanks, Teresa. To first, in terms of mitigation, when it comes down to climate change, one of the main drivers of anthropogenic climate change is greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so in terms of most of the scenarios that we're thinking about, in terms of talking about 1.5 versus 2 versus 2.5, actually speaks to the rate at which we are emitting greenhouse gases. So if we can come up with new forms of technologies that can reduce the emission of, say, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that could have a big impact in terms of the rate of warming going forward. And so mitigation strategies really speak to ways in which we can either reduce greenhouse emissions or capture greenhouse emissions through either new forms of technologies or activities such as reforestation and so on that helps to kind of take out some of the carbon in the atmosphere. So that's kind of mitigating future changes by having new forms of technologies that can reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Many people would say that that's one side of it. But the other side of it is that tomorrow's climate is already entrained, meaning that if you think about it, what you did yesterday is already having an impact on what tomorrow's weather will look like. So there's always a sort of a lag. So if you should even today have a technology that can take out a significant chunk of greenhouse gases, you will still expect to see certain levels of change over time. And so in that regard, there is a need for us to prepare for those changes. And that's where adaptation comes in. And adaptation in this sense means, putting things in place to reduce harm. And in some cases, even taking advantage of some of these changes that are expected to come. And as James kind of pointed out as well, that the impacts are not going to be the same across the board. In some countries, actually having a slightly warmer temperature might benefit them. In other countries, where you're talking about significant disruptions in terms of your rainy season, then the big question is, so what can you put in place to make sure that you can, have systems that can store water in cases of shifts in rainy seasons, if there's going to be a reduction in annual rainfall. And this is something that is interesting because it points to development as well. Like some of these things are necessary anyway. So if you think about Jamaica, yes, you had crazy amount of rain in the past 2 weeks. Where's that water now? You know what I mean? So in terms of, desilting the Mona dam to increase its capacity, thinking about having new forms of like rainwater harvesting technologies, stuff like that. These are ways in terms of you're preparing for these changes.
Kevin, do I need to have something special to be able to adapt? So can anybody adapt? I know there's a difference between coping and adaptation. And if I don't have a house in Ligani, I just have a house. Like, look at those folks that live in Bull Bay in Jamaica, St. Thomas, Jamaica, that were flooded out this week, this weekend. I mean, what are some of the things that persons like them could do if we're talking about adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a couple of things to think about. One, if you're talking about things like coastal inundation, one of the hard questions to think about is, do we need to think of moving people outside of areas that are, prone to being inundated by coastal storm surge or even sea level rise? There is a possibility that we could lose land with sea level rise. So one form of policy in response could be thinking about coastal retreat. In the Caribbean and in many small island states, that's not an easy thing to do because of limited land space. But that is something that might have to come on the table for areas that are considered to be highly vulnerable to sea level rise. But another option is to redesign homes. And I would also say that there are certain like traditional practices in Jamaica that are already there. Like if you go to Portland or St. Mary, you'll go to some communities and you see houses on stilts. And you might consider that weird, but if you actually go into the history and realize that that's what people did back in the days because of river flooding, riverine flooding. And so they've actually adapted to those changes back in the past. And those kind of architectural designs could actually be used in coastal areas, putting houses on stilts, so allowing certain amount of flooding to take place without really impacting people. And from a kind of a geographic standpoint, for us, a hazard is a hazard. It doesn't turn into a disaster until it actually impacts people's like daily lives. So you can actually have two houses in the same area, one on a stilt, one that's not. You can have a certain level of flooding, and the house that's not on a stilt could be ravaged, right? Water go inside, destroy everything for that family. While the other house on the stilt, the water just goes past that house, and those people can go about their daily lives as normal. So there's also like things that we can do from a policy standpoint, providing, kind of safety nets for people who are impacted so they can recover through financial support and so on. That's called disaster mitigation. But also we can have other kind of innovative ideas where we can draw on local knowledge, because people aren't dumb. People have been responding to changes over time. The question is, if the changes that are going to happen in the next few decades are going to be extreme to the point that it might overwhelm existing technologies, then how can we rebuild or redesign those technologies to accommodate those changes?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump into our poll question. Thank you so much for that, Kevin, because this question follows on this nicely. This is question number 2. How do you feel about taking action to combat climate change? It should be on your screen. We're looking at, should we take drastic action is needed to make a difference for the future, or we just need to make a few changes and we'll be on track? Things are gone too far and there's no point of return. Maybe James, you could tune in on, or kind of give us your take on this question. How do you feel about taking action to change?
Yeah, while that's up, I mean, my immediate thought is people sometimes see action on climate as a cost, but there's a lot of things that are reducing climate emissions that make sense for carbon emissions that make sense for other reasons. A great example of this is the Caribbean as a region is really dependent on imported fuel. I think in Jamaica, it's around 10% of GDP is spent on importing fuel. In Guyana, it's closer to a third, obviously changing with the oil exploitation there. But that means that a huge amount of money is leaving the country to be spent on importing fuel. Now, moving to renewables makes sense for climate reasons, but for the Caribbean particularly, and many other regions, but none more so than the Caribbean, it makes sense for business economic reasons to move to renewables because of all this money leaving the country. So I don't think we necessarily always need to see that taking action on climate is a cost. There's lots of things that we can do that make more sense. Another example would be on agriculture. Jamaica is a bit of an exception because there's a lot more food grown in Jamaica, but for some of the smaller islands, 95% or more of food is imported. There's nothing grown locally. So there's a huge issue there. Changing climate presents a threat to how food is produced in the region, but we should be thinking about, okay, how can we reduce the footprint of food, but also make a more sustainable food ecosystem locally as well?
Okay, thanks. And the results are in. We're seeing that most people, 81% of you, say that drastic action is needed. And that really ties in with our theme about taking bold steps. We can't do the little action here and there. We have to be more dramatic to combat this change, because as you said, Jay, earlier, we're not quite sure if we're going to hit that 1.5 or if we're going to go to 2 or 2.5, and we really need to start acting. I remember a quote, I think it was President Obama, that in 2011 at the Rising Sea Summit, he said that we're the last generation, or we're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last that can do anything about it. And I thought that was a very impactful quote, because we can't just sit around and wait for persons to act on our behalf. We personally, the question and action. Here's a question. Our political leaders seem to have been caught off guard by this year's hurricane season. If they were to put together some key climate change messages for people to grasp, and what would they be? I'm going to go over to Jay and kind of ask you to give us your thoughts. You want me to read the question, Jay?
No, that's a tough one. I think I caught that you're reading the question from the Q&A. So that's a really tough one, but I'm going to take it in three parts. I'm going to take it in three parts in a sense from this point. If you look at this hurricane season, it's been unprecedented. We've got numbers that we've never gotten before where tropical storms are concerned. However, there's something interesting that I think a lot of persons miss about our hurricane season. Antigua was mentioned earlier, and Antigua's rainy season and much of the Eastern Caribbean's rainy season starts in June and ends in November. Well, hurricane season starts in June and ends in November. So much of what they consider as water or rain comes from rainfall from systems that would pass. The problem that's happening, those systems are developing a little bit before they get to them. So they're no longer just carrying rain and a little wind, they're carrying rain, much more rain, and they're coming with much more devastating wind. So for the question, I'm going to take it in three parts. So that's first part. Second part is, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jamaica is one of the only countries that has a fund dedicated to natural disasters of rainfall, wind, or that they have some fund in place dedicated to that. The challenge is that that fund is not an accumulating fund. If nothing happens this year, the money is spent. So it's not something that accumulates to a point to say, nothing happened this year, so we are adding on to it so we can better be able to recover or put in place strategies to do things as we may face something 4 years down the line. So it's us, given 10% is spent on oil, there's not much left to do other things. So there's a challenge there. So there's a challenge in how it is that we do even plan for what we're expecting to face. And if there's a challenge in planning for what we're expecting to face, when the really abnormal thing comes in, as the question says, it's going to be a surprise. And I'm using that as an example to say 2019, 2018, we kind of escaped. We were in a drought, but we kind of escaped the massive impacts from rainfall. But that still didn't get us to a point of saying, when rainfall events occur and the impacts of rainfall events, they're not as slow onset as drought. They're far more quick, and devastation is far more wide felt. Roads, agriculture, everything feels it almost instantly after the event passes. We do not actually have that additive or accumulating method of dealing with things. It's always just this year and next year. So I'm taking the best case that's within the Caribbean and saying the best case was still not enough. There's not much else we can do. We can take the best case and improve on it, but within a small fiscal space, there's not much that can be done.
Okay. Kevin, what's your take on that? If you want me to read over the question.
No, I could jump in and just follow up on what Jay said.
Sure. Okay.
You broke that down really well. It's really a difficult question to ask. And I'll just kind of jump in to say, we need to start to kind of make people more aware of some of the possibilities. We're in a new age, in the sense that it's not impossible for, say, Jamaica to have 2 or 3 back-to-back Category 4, Category 5 hurricanes hitting the country in a given season. It's not impossible. It can happen. I mean, Puerto Rico, it got impacted by Hurricane Maria. It did get to some extent hit by Hurricane Irma. Definitely St. Martin got hit by 2 storms, not directly. One was direct, the other one was indirect. Barbuda also. So for me, if you think about the fact that hurricanes are becoming more stronger. And if we think about the fact that the hurricane season can be more active in the next few decades, then we need to start to get back to basics, to think about how do you prepare for these hurricanes? How do you put measures in place to help economies, different sectors, but also people, households, if they're impacted by these storms? And I guess just looking at Jamaica in the recent last week and so, what is clear to me is that we need to be doing a lot more work in terms of local communities, cleaning drains. We need to be looking back at our infrastructure, widening drains where we need to widen drains. If we're thinking about building new roads, put things in place to protect those road networks that are going to be extremely important in a disaster. Thinking about our hospitals, upgrading our hospitals. I mean, I think coronavirus kind of opened up our eyes to realizing in terms of number of emergency beds, the capacity that we have to deal with an emergency. In the case that you might have, large number of injuries and casualties, what are the type of mechanisms that we have in place? I mean, across the region. We have organizations like SEDEMA that are great in terms of putting things in place and liaising, but in terms of resources, I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. And as Jay said, it's only a few countries that I can think of that have things in place that if there is a disaster that they're able to actually respond because they have budgeted for that. We're dealing with a situation of fiscal constraint. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
And tomorrow, actually, we're going to be hearing more on that financing for a sustainable future, because financing it plays a very important part. It plays a very important role in planning for the future and sustainable planning and so forth. So we're also looking forward to that conversation. But we've been focusing a lot on hurricanes. What about droughts? What about sea level rise and other climate change phenomena? Is there anything else that we need to be considering? From that point of view? Those are slower onsets. I know we're going to be talking about in more detail about planning for this uncertain future on Thursday, but give us your thoughts, maybe James, a little bit about some of the other phenomena that we are experiencing, maybe at a slower onset, but we're going to probably have more of it in the future.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, hurricanes, for obvious reasons, are front of mind in the Caribbean, but there are many of these other changes that are happening and will have different impacts in different parts of the region. And droughts are very important one. As you raise that, the impact of that. Again, how does drought impact the food system? How does drought impact water availability? Those are fundamental things that we need to be considering. So there's a whole bigger picture, and if we look outside of the region as well, these are already things that are being seen. So across Central Africa, the Sahara Desert is expanding south into places where people live that are now becoming part of the desert. So we're seeing these changes happen in other parts of the world. The glaciers are melting, as was mentioned before in Greenland, and that affects regions in the mountains like the Himalayas. So these things are happening globally, but I think what we need to be really aware of is food and water supplies, how that impacts the region, because this is an environmental issue, but as was mentioned before, it's also that becomes a political and an economic issue as well. Those things aren't those things can't be separated.
Yeah. All right. I know we have a few minutes remaining, but we have another poll question to ask before I ask maybe a couple of last questions, because we have a question that was posted. But before we get to that, who is responsible for taking action against climate change? I know a lot of people tend to think that it's just, it's the government or it's scientists. Is it a responsibility of the government, the responsibility of the larger countries who are the highest greenhouse gas emitters, or is it mine and everybody else's responsibility? Let's see. We're going to leave it for another 10 seconds.
I was gonna say I have a comment on this, but I won't skew the results, so I'll wait
Sure.
till they've come in.
All right. All right. So the results are in. 83% of people said it is mine and everybody's responsibility. And I'm very heartened by that response because it really is our responsibility as well. So James, I'm gonna.
Well,
you said you had something
I
to
have
add.
an unpopular opinion, I guess, and it's not to say, of course, it is everyone's responsibility. We all need to take some level of responsibility, but I do think that argument sometimes passes the buck by trying to make it, having this focus on the individual kind of misses the bigger picture. When you look at the huge corporations that are responsible for so much of emissions, by telling someone that they need to I mean, yes, we should recycle and do your composting and whatever else you're doing at home, but by telling someone that they can't take their annual vacation or something like that kind of misses the real point when you see the level coming out from these huge corporations. So my answer to that would have actually been government. Obviously, government does what people tell them to do or should do, and people need to put pressure on their governments, but government needs to be regulating large corporations, and government needs to be taking part in these global discussions to make all countries. And so back to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was amazing to have over 190 countries sign up. You have Iran and Saudi Arabia and the US and Russia all signing on to the same agreement. That's unprecedented. So I'm really heartened that the US will be rejoining that instead of sabotaging it, which is what they've been doing for the past 4 years. But yeah, so yes, we do need to do our own bits, but let's not pretend that individuals can solve this. This has to be done on the global level.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. As we come to a close for a great session today, before I ask you guys to just give me a 5-second, I'm going to ask you if 5 seconds, all right, 10 seconds. Just a wrap-up message that you want to leave with your viewers. I just wanted to say, give a shout out to our sponsors and our partners. We have Scotiabank, Coca-Cola, Junk Cayman, and Cayman Business Solutions. And as you know, today is just day 2 of a great lineup for the rest of the week. We are going all the way to day 5, which is on Friday. Tomorrow, we're talking about financing for a sustainable future, achieving economic growth with sustainable development. And on Thursday, we're talking about planning for an uncertain future. And we touched on some of those things today. And on Friday, we're talking about waste management strategies in the Caribbean, and then we do a wrap up. So we have a great lineup for the rest of the week. But I'm going to, here's one more question in the chat. It's about marine litter. What about litter? And is this linked with season? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, let me check. Close that. It's techie. I'm just looking for. Scientists or a climate ministry that focus change is great. It's mainly funding. How do we get the parliaments to invest? How do we get the government, I suppose, to invest in this from national? Oh, it's a big question. I don't know I have, but Kevin, if you could just give us your take that.
Sorry, just to be clear, like, was the question asking what can we do to get Parliament to set aside funds for climate?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's a good question, and I think that's something that we need to think about in terms of advocacy and so on. I think the governments across the region know what's happening, as we've seen in the cases over the past few years. Um, I think, as I think James said, and I'm just going to say this for a few seconds, that the government represents us, and I think based off how we advocate for these type of changes, that's the only way we're going to see these changes happening. So I think there's a role for us, for civil society, to play in terms of getting governments to budget for that. So that's the only thing I can say now, because it's a very complex question and I can't answer it within a few minutes. So I think there is a role for advocacy.
Yeah, I know.
That's the only thing I can say. But it's a good question, you know.
Okay. Yes, it is. Thank you so much, response, Kevin. All right. So in 10 seconds, is there, what message would you like to leave us with here today? Starting with Jay.
All right. So 10 seconds is a little bit short, and I'm going to let you know that I'm going to take 30. So first and foremost, if you looked at what happened for rainfall this year, persons would think that we would have superseded all the amounts, all the totals that we would have gotten. But in truth and in fact, we are just about at the average. What is happening and what is projected to happen is the distance between our rainfall events is going to increase. So our rain events will massively be, so if the distance increases but your total remains the same, it does mean when you get rainfall, you are expected to get much more. One point I'd like to note is Dr. Riney actually alluded to dam. Dam was at 30% before our last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, at 30%. And within the first 3 days of rainfall, the dam was at 100% capacity, which means everything after that point was excess rainfall, right? So we have to change some of what we've been doing to get to the point where we take, it's no longer going to a river, or I call them constructed rivers, gullies, and that leads it into the Kingston Harbor out to sea, but it should be going into a space that is then pumped into be it an aquifer or man-made aquifer, man-made system, and then left for 5 to 10 years to undergo its natural cleansing process, or not long it needs to be sit there for us to then pump it back out. There has to be a change in how we do things, but the investment to do so is the question, the capital question to do so. So whether or not the government is going to set up a business that is going to sell that or sell that a little later on and list that company as private equity on some stock exchange, that could be an ingenious way to actually try to get buy-in for something like that. But the takeaway from this is that we're at a point where what we're facing right now is a new reality, but it will not be our permanent reality if things continue. In fact, we are actually expecting our new reality to not last very long. So that's my 30 seconds and more.
I think that was more than 30 seconds, but that was great. Thank you so much, Jay, for that takeaway message. James, over to you. What are you imparting with us today?
It's not all doom and gloom. There is hope. I know this. It's easy to focus on the negative when we talk about climate change. It is overwhelming. It is depressing, but there is something we can do, and I think that's the message. So I don't want to leave people feeling disheartened, but there's a lot of work to be done. It is mitigation, so it is on reducing emissions, but it's also on adaptation. And I think we have, as a species, as humans, we have the ability to innovate and solve problems. So there is a way to get out of this in the future. But thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, James, for that positive takeaway. Kevin, what's your message today?
Following up on James' lead, necessity is the mother of all inventions. And I think this moment is forcing us to rethink our lifestyle. So for me, I've always described climate change as a lifestyle disease. It's a type of model of development that we've had over the past 150 years. And here we are now at a point where we can finally change that course. So, for me, it's definitely not a doom and gloom. This is a moment of possibilities. And I think people should be at the center of that change as we go forward.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for such an informative discussion today. And I really like the messages and the takeaway messages that you've left with us today. That it's a change, but it's not all doom and gloom. We can do something about it. And just a reminder for all of you who are planning to join us or who didn't even know that we had more sessions for the rest of the week. Remember, tomorrow we're talking about sustainable financing for a sustainable future. And we're going to be also looking at planning for an uncertain future. And if you haven't been able to get all your questions answered, please look out, follow our social media pages for any future updates. And we really thank you so much, gentlemen. Climate change really is our new reality. And I'm interested in it from a scientific perspective, but we all should be interested in it because it impacts us. There's a lot of, it has a serious impact on our lifestyle. And so thank you so much again for joining us. And please join us again for the rest of the week in all our interactive sessions. Enjoy. Bye.
Thanks for having us, Teresa. It was real fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
This was fun.